Hey, welcome to the Book Bar, where everything bookish is on the menu. I'm Ann Jeanette Barr, and today's special is going to be all the books I read in 2020, which was a lot. So I brewed myself some stress relief tea because 2020, and I'm going to tell you about the 170 books that I read last year. But first of all, this is my first video on my new channel, and I am so happy to finally be recording. I had to wait ages and ages for all the equipment to arrive because, again, 2020, I ordered things months and months ago, and they just trickled in super slowly. But they're here and I'm ready, and I have so many good videos planned, so make sure you subscribe. I've got just one after the other planned, and I feel like this one and the next three are just going to be the intro for this channel so that you can get to know me a little bit. So before I tell you about my books that I read in 2020, I'll tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me personally. So I am a writer. I am an author and also a freelance writer. And I also hope to become very soon a literary agent. So I just started courses to get a certificate in literary representation. And I'll do a video all about that another time. But just this journey through publishing has been so much fun, and I have so many things to say about books that here I am. So I happen to be a wife to a librarian, and so there's a lot of books, and then we homeschool, and we have 4 very bookish children. So books are the thing here in the Barr household, and I am going to be so excited to share my children's favorites with you guys as well, because they are totally in on this channel behind the scenes and they want to be in front of the camera. So why did I read 170 books last year? Is that normal for me? No. I remember a few years ago I was reading Stephen King's On Writing, and if you haven't read it, you definitely need to. And he was talking about how he read over 100 books every year, and I thought, that man is insane. He probably is insane, although he's also lovely. I really, really hope that you read that book. But 100 books sounded just so big to me. And then I did it and then some this year. But I will tell you right off that the reason that I read 170 books is frankly because I was paid to. So I was trying to think of another way to say, I would have read 170 books if I had had the time. I don't think, well, we'll get to that. Maybe at the end I'll say if I'd ever do this again. You can probably guess. So I got paid to read a lot of books this year because I was employed as a book contest judge. So I'm not going to tell you just yet which book contest it was because I technically haven't gotten paid yet. I want to make sure that happens. I mean, it will happen, but I want to have it all done so that then I can talk about the whole experience with you and then get their permission to tell you which contest it was. It was a lot of fun. It was a great learning experience, but it required me to read way more than I normally would. So I normally read 50 to 75 books a year max. That's like a good year. And this year, 170 was a lot. After I read the first round, there were 2 contests that I judged, and the first contest, I read it and I said, oh my goodness, I don't know if I'm ever doing that again. That was so much work. And then they were like, hey, do you want to do it again? And I was like, oh, but it was really fun. So I did it again. And I ended up reading not as many books the second time. I gave them my numbers that I wanted. But I ended up more than doubling what I would have read. So I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to give you some graphs over here and look at my notes here and tell you what I read just for fun and what I read that I was paid for, and then also the genres and other details about what I read. And while I'm doing this, go ahead and comment and tell me how many books you read in 2020 and if that was high or low for you. Some people just read so much more than normal because they were home more, and some people felt stressed and read less than they ever normally read, and I totally understand both. So, okay, of 170 books, 29 of them were books I read to my children. So I'm only counting chapter books. I have 4 children, ages almost 6 to almost 13. They might be 6 and 13 by the time this video goes live. The 13-year-old probably will have had his birthday. And we still read picture books a lot, but I'm only counting chapter books. So 29 of those were chapter books. 24 of them were books I read for pleasure that were also chapter books. And 117 of them were books I read for work. So I read a lot of books that I got paid to read. And it is a little bit different kind of reading, I have to say. I was reading critically because I had to evaluate these books, and also if they weren't necessarily books that I would have chosen off of a shelf. So sometimes that meant reading even maybe a little less closely because the content matter didn't interest me, but paying attention to the highlights, like the dialogue or the plot, or if it was a nonfiction book, making sure that they were consistent. It was a different experience than reading just because I felt like reading it. Although there are plenty of nonfiction books that I also read that way, where I'm reading it for a specific reason, right? So anyhow, 24 books for pleasure, I think, is maybe a little fewer than I would normally read, like adult books. Some of them are YA. I like reading YA, young adult books, just because sometimes it's a different experience than reading adult. And my children aren't quite old enough for most young adult yet. My 13-year-old, almost 13-year-old, is getting there. And then 29 to the children is probably on par with how many chapter books I usually read, maybe a few more, because they are just really into being read to. And some of those books I even read to my older children only, and some of them were to all of them. So I'll do a video at some point on the way that I keep track of my reading, and then at some point I do another video on how I choose books for my kids and why I read aloud so much. So that was how that breakdown went. Other interesting things that I noted down were 5 of them were ARCs, ARCs, advanced reader copies. 5 of them were books that I was sent by the author to read before they were published, before they were officially out to the rest of the world. So that was not paid work except for the free book, but also reading with the understanding that I would give the author feedback or write a review, or so that I could get the word out for them, which I always enjoy doing. And then 9 of them were rereads. So that just shocks me. I read 9 books a second time. I used to be a person who would not reread anything because life is just too short and there's so many good books out there. But I think a lot of that, maybe all of it, I should go back and look, was because I was reading to my kids. And so there were books that I had read previously that I wanted them to read, or that I had read to the older children and now I wanted to read to the younger children. So, also, I read a couple of new genres for me. I had never read a true crime book, which technically is nonfiction, but reads like fiction. It's narrative nonfiction. And I had never read any steampunk literature. So it's not that I would be opposed to steampunk, because I totally like the genres that skirt around steampunk. Historical fiction, sci-fi, fantasy are all like my thing. But I had not read any steampunk until this year. So I quite enjoyed it, and I'm going to have to read more. So I can't actually say the names of a lot of the books that I read because I was paid to do it. But I am going to tell you at the end, after this little section, what my top 5 books that I read of the, how many is that? 55 books. Don't do my math. That I read that I didn't get paid for. I'm going to tell you my top 5 of those. So hang in there for that. But I wanted to break it down by genre, and this chart is going to include all of the books. So by genre, I read a lot of genres, so it was kind of hard to decide how I was going to break this down. And I decided to not break down the children's and middle grade and YA books into specific genres. So I read 38 books that were either children's or middle grade. And that line is kind of hard to say. Some books are obviously geared toward young kids, but not many chapter books are, right? So I've lumped together children's and middle grade books. Some of those were for reading to my children. Some of them were for work. I read 16 young adult books. So again, some of those were for work, some were to my children, and some were just for me. And then I just kind of broke these down randomly. So I should have done this in order, but it's not how it's going to look. You just have to enjoy the graph. I read 49 adult nonfiction, 30 memoirs. I only read 3 adult fantasy, which is low for me, I think, although I do read young adult fantasy, so, you know. 3 adult fantasy, like I said, 3 adult classics. Some of those children's, middle grade, YA were also classics, but 3 adult classics, 5 adult historical fiction, 1 true crime, 1 adult dystopian, 2 adult thrillers, 2 adult mysteries, 2 adult romance, 3 collections of short stories, and then 15 of what I'm just calling literary or general nonfiction. Some of it was higher literary fiction, but some of it was not nonfiction, fiction, adult fiction that doesn't necessarily have that literary feel, but I didn't have another category for it. General fiction and literary fiction. So one thing that I do have to do a video that really recaps this experience of being a contest judge, but one of the downsides of reading 170 books is that when I went to make this list that I'm about to share with you of my top 5, there were a lot of books that I had a hard time remembering the plot. Now, that obviously they probably didn't make it in my top 5 if I couldn't remember them because they didn't stick with me. But I found when I was looking through the titles of the 170 that the really good ones stood out and I remembered them, and the really bad ones stood out and I remembered them. And everything that was kind of in the middle, I went, what was that? What was that about? Or I just had little snippets. So, yeah, I think, here's my answer to that question. I think 170 is too many books for me. Maybe when I'm older and my children are not as dependent on me, I will whiz through some years of books and read a lot. But 170 was a lot of books. It was a lot. And I also wasn't reading a genre that was kind of fast. Like, I know a lot of romance readers will zoom through a book a day or a book every other day because they want to consume them in whole. It's like a meal. But I don't tend to read those kind of books. And I think the closest I would get to that is young adult. Sometimes young adult fiction is an easy enough read or a compelling enough read that's not complicated that I will, binge it essentially in a day or two. But most of those others were not like that. So I was really pushing myself to read 170. Okay, time for my top 5 books of 2020. These were not all published in 2020, and I didn't buy them all in 2020, but I happened to read them all for pleasure in 2020. No one paid me to read these books, so these were the ones that stood out to me as most enjoyable last year that I did not get paid for because there were some good books in that stack, but I can't share them. So I'm just going to start by kind of the youngest audience and work up. So this first one is The Backward Kitty. It's part of the Beeg the Barn Cat series, and it is Beeg and not Big, and the story explains why, by Trista Shea. And actually, this is one of the arcs that I read, and I loved it so much that I bought the hardcover because it is so sweet. Let me see if I can share it. There's these cute doodles, and in the back matter, There are things like recipes and games. Let me see if I can find games and activities to go with it that my kids just thought were so fantastic. And I know they're going to want to read these over and over again. There's character profiles, lots of extras. So funny story about this is we read it as a family, as an ebook, and then we gave her our feedback, and my little 5-year-old said, I give it 5 quintillion stars. And if you go to her website, it was at some point, it probably still is, my little Arthur's review of 5 quintillion stars is there. So short recap, it's kind of a fall scene. It's a Halloween-y story, but it's not scary at all. And my children all enjoyed it. It has a very conversational tone, and you can really hear the characters, who are cats, in their personalities speaking, which is not surprising because Trista Shea is actually a voice actress. So you can hear that. You can hear that she loves that banter, that dialogue. And my kids were in stitches the whole time. It's just a sweet, simple story, and it's part of a series that there are 3 of now, and there will be more. So make sure you check that out. And then I read this book, I'm not really numbering these 1 to 5, just of the 5. I read this one to my daughter the Saturdays as part of our mother-daughter book club. And it is actually, year 3 I have it marked. So this is part of our 3rd grade kind of free reading curriculum if we wanted to do that in a specific year. But it's a classic. There's the cover. It's a classic written in I should know this because we talked about this in our book club, 1941, and it's about 4 siblings, which is nice because of our family, who are bored, and they decide that they are going to make a club, and they are going to hold this club on Saturday. And the Saturday club is kind of unconventional. I'll just tell you, for you parents, without any spoilers about the fun that happens on the Saturdays. They decide to pool their allowance and give it all to one person. So that person, that sibling, on the Saturday can have a bigger adventure. So each kid gets essentially 4 allowances to go and have fun. And this is just full of laughs and also full of some really poignant moments. It was a great book to discuss with my daughter and with her group, and it's part of a series, so then she was able to go on and read the other books in the series, which I always love. I love to read them the first book and get them started and then do the rest. Let them do the rest. So next book is Little Women. I did not read this copy. This is my son's copy. It says year 5, but he's reading it this year as a 7th grader. I probably can't give spoilers to this because you guys probably have at least seen the movie, right? But there's some sad moments in Little Women, and he stopped right before the sad moments I can see in his bookmark. So I had not read Little Women before. This is not one that I reread, and I actually listened to it on audio. So I have all these fun memories of what I was doing while I listened to this rather long book, because this is you can get Little Women as a single volume that has Little Women and Good Wives, I think is what it's called, together as a book, as a single book, which this is, and so is my audio. Or you can get them as 2 separate books. They're published both ways, but I didn't know that, and it doesn't matter. They're both stories are great stories, but it took a long time to listen to on audio, and while I was listening to it, I was building my chicken and duck coop, and I was cleaning like big areas of the house, and specific scenes I can remember listening to in different places. So that's so much fun about audiobooks. But man, this book hit me hard as a mother. It hit me hard as a woman. It hit me hard as the memories of how I felt as a child. It's so good. And if you still haven't gotten to Little Women, even if you've seen the movies, because this is an exception to my normal rule of I hate to read the book after I've seen the movie. I almost always will forego a movie that I know has a book that's gotten good reviews, because it usually ruins me to read a book when I know the plot line. I'm very much a plot person. This was not that way. It's so good. There's so many things that they couldn't have included in the movie, or they chose not to. The movies, there's several, and they're all good in different ways. So anyway, read the book. Read it. Tell me if you love it. I'm now a huge Little Women fan, and I want to read Little Men this year. So I'll be doing that for sure. Okay. Whew, sorry, I talk a lot. Number 4, are we on? Okay. Hidden Current. I'm not positive if this is supposed to be an adult or a young adult fantasy. It has a young protagonist, but I think it's adult. There's nothing that would keep me from letting a teenager read it, though. It is an inspirational fantasy, and if you're not familiar with the inspirational fiction genre, that specifically means that it's Christian. So it's written by a Christian author to a Christian audience. So I know this won't be on everyone's list. I like reading this genre sometimes because you know what to expect. It's kind of like the romance genre where you know there's going to be a happy ending or it's not really a romance. Well, there are certain themes in inspirational fiction that you can always count on, and that's comforting. So I'll do another video sometime on inspirational fiction, why I read it, what I think about it from like a literary criticism standpoint, because some of you are probably thinking, but is it any good? And yeah, I'll do all that in another video. This one is by Sharon Hink, who is one of my very favorite authors of all time. She has several series. My favorite is her Restorer series. And she tends to choose protagonists that I can relate to, which doesn't always happen in fantasy books, but I love fantasy. So it's nice to have that to rely on with Sharon's books. And I've spoken to her in person about kind of our literary tastes, and we like the same kind of books. And so I do think that she's just an author that fits me really well. And she understands this beauty, this beautiful potential of fantasy books to share with us truth in a way that's not so in your face, because it's another world, right? So we kind of hear it easier. So there's a lot of potential in fantasy books to really get us thinking that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And this is one of those books, and I know that she enjoys that about fantasy, so I always go into her books reading knowing that I'm going to find things to mull over. This is the beginning of a series, a trilogy, and I have the second one over here that I am also going to read. It already has a torn dust jacket because children. Actually, it might have been a puppy. I don't know. But I haven't read this one yet. So this is the first in a trilogy about a world where the magic system is controlled, is that the right way to put it? By dancing. Dancing and magic are interwoven. And this world, the very movement of the world relies upon dancers. So such an interesting and new idea for a fantasy book, and she just did it really well, and I really liked our heroine and the struggles that she went through. I thought they were very believable for a fantasy. And yeah, just a hint of romance. It was really good. So I would suggest, if you are not opposed to reading inspirational fiction, to check this series out for sure. And then my last one, again, not in any particular order, this doesn't even have a dust jacket, is Unbroken. So this is my only nonfiction on the list. Yeah. When we were visiting family a couple of years ago, my husband's uncle gave him this book and said, you just have to read it. And we put it on a shelf and we didn't touch it for a long time. And then this year, when I was looking for something to kind of cleanse my palate from all those other books that I hadn't chosen, I picked this one up because I heard something about it, or I just felt like I needed to get something off my shelves. I don't know. It was kind of a random choice, and it just shocked me. I mean, it's one of those books that I had heard good reviews about, but I didn't have any idea what it was specifically about. And so I kind of opened it without really knowing. I didn't even have a cover to go off of. And oh my goodness, you guys. So Laura Hillenbrand is an excellent writer. She also wrote Seabiscuit, which I have not read, but I have also heard amazing things about. And you can tell that she has that knack for taking a subject that you wouldn't necessarily think you were interested in and then talking about it in a way that makes you see why people would be interested in it and just immerses you in that story. So Unbroken is, sorry, oh, I feel like I need to hold it, or I'm going to need to reference it and not be able to. Unbroken is about a man, essentially a single man, but it talks about many different men who fought in World War II. And this man specifically, it follows his early life, and then when he's in the military, in the army, and there's a disaster. I'm like, oh no, how much do I tell you? Okay, this isn't really spoiler. Oh, this is hard. Okay, well, how about no spoilers, but I do want you to go and read a review if you have not read this book with spoilers if you're on the fence, because it's so worth it. Okay, so no spoilers except for one, and that is he is part of an airplane crash. So it follows, there's a lot of the story before that, so that's the spoiler, but then there's a lot of the story after it, and how he survives and what he goes through. And okay, so a lot of this, so this is a World War II book, obviously. I have a lot of knowledge about World War II. I like history. My father is just very interested in World War II history, and so I've grown up learning a lot about it, but a lot of times it was the European theater that I learned about, not the Pacific theater. And so I didn't really know a lot of these details, which shocked me, because little background about me, if you've gotten this far into the video, I have a degree in Japanese area studies. So that's my bachelor's degree. So I know a lot about Japan, but I know a lot about ancient Japan, and I know a lot about contemporary Japan. And World War II in Japan, what I know about it is still, I think, from a fairly Western I don't know. From a Western perspective, is that really true? Or I'll tell you my experience of being in Japan and visiting Hiroshima and Nagasaki, visiting the Peace Park and Museum, is that there's just a mourning and a loss and a obvious sadness about World War II, and not any kind of, I never got an impression of any kind of pride or glory. And so it's hard for me to see Japanese people in the light that this book puts them, or Japan as a nation, because I wasn't alive then, and that's not been my experience of Japan. So it was shocking. It was awful. It was hard to read what happened to prisoners of war in World War II in Japan. It was one of those books where if I ever feel like I want to complain in my life ever again, and this book comes to mind, I will have nothing to complain about. It's really difficult. So if you can find the space to read a really difficult, really beautiful, exquisitely written narrative nonfiction this year or in your future, definitely try that one. Okay, so thanks for sitting through my first video on this channel, and I hope that you come back for the rest of them. And my next ones, I'm going to be telling you about what I'm going to read this year. Like I said, I'm not going to try and read 170 books again, but I don't want to tell you just yet how many I am going to try and read. So that's another video. And then also, I am going to make a video about all the books I bought myself for Christmas, because I'm still really excited about them. So that's it. Thanks for coming to the book bar, and tell me in the comments what you're reading and what's in your cup.